Well, hello there everyone. UXW Bill here with you once again in high definition. Why high definition? Well, primarily that's a matter of the fact that this HDR PJ200 is the Handycam I happen to have to hand. It's another boring Tuesday night, and as you can tell, I've been getting into trouble after sitting around bored for a while. Let me go ahead and tell you about what I've spent the last hour or so fiddling around with. You might question the value of messing around with something like this, but in my view at least, it's better than what's on TV, especially later when the president comes on with his State of the Union address. Okay, don't mind me too much. That's just my sarcastic side coming out here. I ran into someone recently who told me that they had a couple of old video cameras that they hadn't gotten around to throwing away, and I expressed interest in them, so I actually happened to get a hold of them today. They're all three Sony Handycams. Two of them are late 80s, very early 90s models. I haven't actually played around with them just yet, primarily because I'm pretty sure that both of them are badly impacted by faulty surface-mounted electrolytic capacitors. And given that they're, at least 25 years old at this point, well, I don't really think that they're altogether worth bothering with, although maybe someday if I'm really bored I might have a shot at it, because you know what, there's something else that uses those nasty surface mounted electrolytic capacitors that start leaking over time. Not just Macintosh logic boards, but IBM PS2 floppy drives, and as you can imagine, with my PS2 collection being what it is, well, I have collected quite a few of those drives that need some electrolytic capacitor therapy over the years. I even still happen to have a few of them. I decided to start with the newest camcorder of the bunch, not just because it happened to be the newest unit of the bunch, but also because I figured it stood the best chance of working, and it actually happened to have tape in it. Well, I hooked the camcorder up to power, and I discovered that things were not a very happy situation. And I probably should have shot this video while I was actually working on diagnosing this unit, because I think there are a fair number of you folks out there that would actually like to see me do that instead of this after-the-fact stream of consciousness rambling kind of stuff that I'm engaged in right now. I found that the power connection on the camcorder was actually intermittent. That I could wiggle this and it would flicker on and off on the status display over here. And when I could get it to make contact, I discovered that the camcorder would power up in the VCR mode. It absolutely refused to do anything in the camcorder mode. So I started to delve into it. As you can see, I've got it all taken apart right now, and even in its mostly disassembled state right now, you actually could shoot a video with it. I suppose that I could have gone for some mad props here by putting the videotape back in there and actually having had it running while I'm shooting this introduction, but I didn't actually do that. Now, my first goal here was forget about the camcorder. It's really not that exciting. It's a CCD-TR517, I believe. A Video 8 model with extra resolution or extended resolution. All I know for sure is that Sony called it XR, and it does in fact add, I believe, about 80 lines worth of television detail to the picture that it happens to record. So in this era of 4K and high definition, really not very exciting. But you know me and forgotten videotapes, although I do not make the overwhelming majority of them that I have found ever a matter of public record, mainly because I do have some slight concerns about that, which I discussed in the video immediately prior to this one. I do find it interesting to watch these tapes. So as I said, my primary goal was to get the tape out of this machine. I'll go ahead and tell you a little bit about how I did that in case you're faced with the same thing. Now, if you don't care about the camcorder, you can engage in violence. You can just tear the hell out of it and pry the tape basket open. But in this case, I decided, since it almost seemed to be alive, that maybe it was worth not just tearing the living daylights out of it and trying to find a better way to take things apart here. So I got my size 0 Phillips screwdriver, and I got on the computer, found the service manual for this camcorder, and I started, as you can plainly see, to take it apart. You start up here at the lens and power switch assembly, then you move on to the side cabinet and some stuff at the rear, and then and only then can you actually get at the tape basket and the tape assembly to try and unload the tape. So how does this work? How do you unload a tape from one of these manually? Well, the first thing I would recommend that you do as you try to find the service manual for yours. A surprising number of these are actually available for download with a well-placed web search. And even if you can't find your exact model, chances are good that your model of Handycam may use a mechanism that was used across several other models for which you might be able to find service manuals. Now you can see I've gone ahead and disconnected these ribbon cables here, and when I do that, I can take this side panel almost completely free of the unit, but not quite. I've got to get this ribbon cable up here. And these are a bit fiddly, so be careful if you care about the camcorder ever working again after you get this done, though depending upon the circumstances under which it ate a tape, you might not. Alright, so now we can see a good deal more of the tape mechanism, and the one thing that you can see right away is that right next to the head drum there's a little motor sitting here, a little DC permanent magnet motor, kind of a cheap little thing. It looks out of place in a precision mechanism like this one. I could see no evidence of a gross malfunction. Sometimes the pinch rollers in these camcorders, they tend to migrate or fall out because the little plastic sleeve upon which they're seated comes unglued. There are some people who have had luck cutting out a piece of an ink pen tube, like from a cheap Bic pen, and putting that pinch roller back into place with that as a collar between it and the idler sleeve, the shaft that it rides on. I've never had to do that. I've never actually seen one of these come up and loose, but there are no shortage of videos on YouTube where people have had that problem with the pinch roller, and some of them have managed to put it back into place successfully. So what do you do to get a recalcitrant tape out of one of these camcorders? Well, the first thing that you want to do, if you care about the camcorder in the slightest, is to disconnect this ribbon cable down here, and that will serve to protect the circuitry that drives this motor, because if you apply voltage to this motor and this ribbon cable is still connected down here, you're probably going to end up smoking something on the camcorder's logic board. Now this probably won't be a video that's useful to anyone unless they have a camcorder that is based on this same exact mechanism. Luckily Sony used this particular mechanism for a long time. Well, the next thing that you've got to do in order to get your tape to come out of here is you've got to get this motor to run. And we've already disconnected this connection down here, so the next thing to do is to power the motor. Now Sony's service manual says use 5 volts to do this. I was a naughty boy. That's not a smoke detector that I borrowed from the other room in the basement and took the battery out of. That's merely an illusion, and this is not the battery from that smoke detector either. I stuck that battery onto the 2 solder points on the end of the motor. Now you'll want to be careful if you do this, if the motor seems to be straining unusually, and again, if you care about the camcorder at all, you don't want to let that motor force anything, because all the gears and stuff that it drives are actually made of plastic. Now, once you get this running in the right direction, it's a simple matter of watching for the tape basket to move out. But there is another gotcha here. If you're not very, very careful, when this basket pops up, your tape is still going to be in the fully loaded position, a U-style pattern around this head drum. And so if you're not very, very careful, and if you don't pull the tape back into the cassette, you're going to have a crinkled tape and probably some picture dropouts. And I did actually crinkle the tape slightly because my timing was a little bit off, and when you power this motor from a 9-volt battery, this mechanism unloads quickly. So what do you do to avoid crinkling your tape? Well, you look very carefully inside the mechanism here. You can see there's a little white gear just slightly to the right of the pause button, and you can turn this with the edge of a fine-tipped screwdriver, and when you do, that will move the take-up reels in the deck mechanism, and you can gradually and gently wind the tape back into your cassette. And when you have the tape wound back, you can gradually alternate between winding the tape up and ejecting the basket. And then you will be able to get your tape out of there undamaged. So what about the rest of this story? What ended up happening to this camcorder? Well, since I didn't damage anything in getting the tape out, I thought I ought to have a shot at diagnosing this. And this is where I probably should have started recording video, but I was too engrossed in what I was doing, and I'm sure that many of you have probably been in a similar place. I started making checks to see what did and did not work on the camcorder, and I arrived at the conclusion very quickly that there were three main areas of functionality that weren't working. The camera mode, the eject button for the tape basket, which isn't actually here right now, it's actually on this part of the camcorder, and also these transport buttons were completely unresponsive. Well, since the camcorder's electronics basically seemed to be working and that it would power up and stuff, I decided to employ some critical thinking and start tracing the circuitry throughout the machine. Now, these circuits are probably diagrammed in the schematic, but in this case, if you can follow where things are going, you really don't need much of a schematic to go on. You can just follow the various ribbon cables, and boy, are there ever a lot of them. So the first thing that I started doing was to try and figure out exactly which ribbon cable was responsible for relaying communication from these buttons, presumably the zoom control, the eject switch, and the one thing that would kill power to this particular series of Sony Handycams if the circuit was being interrupted, this black switch around the red record button. I really don't profess to understand the point of this. I think this is kind of a stupid design because this can, as previously mentioned, if you set it to the lock position, completely kill power to the camcorder and make someone who is not familiar with these machines think that it's totally dead. I suppose the idea was to allow for you to temporarily put the camcorder in a pocket or something so that you wouldn't accidentally turn it on. Well, it's a little bit big for a pocket, so, you know, a camcorder bag, and then be able to return it rapidly to an operable shooting mode without having to actually operate the primary power switch on the front of the unit. I guess someone at Sony eventually saw the light, because that lock and standby switch did eventually disappear from these particular Handycams and the models that succeeded them. Alright, so I kept following things around here, and at first I thought that maybe the ribbon cable... Where'd that thing go? I have to find it here. Here it is again. I thought that the ribbon cable coming off of the transport control buttons delivered the signal to this board. And I was wrong. I also attempted to diagnose this flip switch over here, the lock and the standby, thinking, well, if that switch has dirty contacts, it might prevent operation of the camcorder completely, even in the VCR mode, although I don't believe that to be the case. So I unscrewed this screw, and I actually took this switch out of here, which you can do, and I very, very carefully dribbled a little bit of contact cleaner into it. Naturally, there was no improvement, although in my view it certainly can't have hurt to clean the contacts in that switch after all of these years, because one thing I have noticed gets touchy on these camcorders, and I have another one that I will make a video about in the future that I bought like 2 years ago at a thrift store, so much for doing things in a timely fashion, has this this scroll wheel to get through the menu and set the titler that has become jumpy. I actually have two Handycams that are like that, but in the case of one I don't care because the tape mechanism on it is completely trashed, and all it is a video source for my live streaming studio activities. Alright, so I continued the troubleshooting. I discovered that this actually delivers the signal. This actually carries the signal to and from the transport control buttons through this board and onward to something else. So I was stopped for a while. I was like, how is this board getting a signal delivered to it? What connects this board? And at first, I didn't have any idea. And then it slowly kind of dawned on me, and I felt pretty stupid for not realizing this. I thought that this little pigtail here was probably part of the service fixture that Sony mentions in the service manual for these camcorders. But now I have come to believe that's definitely not true. That's definitely not true in the case of these units. And I believe that this connector down here probably performs that role. This actually connects the main logic board in the camcorder, you guessed it, to this board. And although this cable was plugged in, it wasn't making good contact. And so it actually ended up killing the lock and standby switch, the record button, the eject button, which is why the transport wouldn't unload and why I resorted to ejecting the cassette manually, and of course all the playback buttons up here, and probably the wide angle and telephoto lever as well. So after reseating this, the camcorder sprang to life on both the VCR and camera modes. It's been a little finicky since then. That was also not the only finicky thing that I found out, that I discovered when I was working with this camcorder. When I first plugged it in, I mentioned having to play with this a little bit, and it looks like, unfortunately, this power connector has been abused somewhat during this camcorder's life, and unfortunately I don't think I've really got a good fix for that. It does look like this module can be replaced as a separate part, so maybe if I decide to cannibalize another Handycam for parts that's got a much more serious problem than this one, I could exchange this. Likewise, it is entirely possible that Sony had this piece available as a service part, and maybe the cost of it wouldn't be too terribly shocking. I have not investigated that particular avenue. So now what remains is to go ahead and put this camcorder back together and see if it still happens to function like it should, at which point I will probably actually shoot some test video with it. I'll have to digitize that video and capture it on the computer, since this is an analog Handycam that I'm working with, being as it uses the Video 8 recording format. And I will probably upload that as a separate video a little bit later on. Alright, so I'm going to go ahead and put this back together. And no, I'm not going to record this because there is going to be some guesswork and probably some swearing along the way. So I apologize if you want to see that. One of the things that I will have to figure out is where these two metal pieces that fell out of the back end go. Hopefully the service manual will shed some light on that, because their exact function is a little bit ambiguous. I believe that they probably, considering that there's this opening right here in both of them, may have something to do with the carrying strap that was on this camcorder. So back in just a few. Okay, for those of you who are playing along at home, it took me a little bit of figuring, but I did get this figured out. The two metal pieces that came loose when I took apart this camcorder, and I probably took apart a little bit more than I had to, although I don't think there was any other way to get this side of the camcorder's case off. The first metal piece goes up here and mounts as shown. It's held in by this screw over here. And then the second metal piece goes in something like this, right around the charger and AC input contacts. You do want to be careful to route these wires correctly, otherwise something might get pinched or shorted, and we'd definitely rather not have that. Now, I also engaged in the highly delicate ballet, not so much for this connector, which was the cause of all the trouble and all the reason that these controls didn't work as previously outlined, but this connector up here, which goes to the playback and wide-angle telephoto zoom control, that one was a fun one to do, because there's a little plastic guide piece underneath it that provides for a tab that you can grab instead of grasping the conductors in that plastic metal strip and potentially tearing them. And it's kind of a delicate ballet to get that whole thing lined up. The way that I found to do it that actually worked well was to pivot this piece out and set it at kind of an offset angle, so that strip of that conductive strip could be pushed directly into the circuit board, and then everything could be connected. And as you can see, I have actually screwed it down. So the last major pieces of assembly to be done here, apart from the front panel and the tape door and the input-output cover, the audio and video input and output cover, is to put the battery and the battery framework back into place. And then we'll see if I still have a working camcorder. Up to this point, it's still working just fine. I also went ahead before I put this together and I burnished the contacts at both ends very, very gently with this screwdriver. You don't want to get too rambunctious with this, no matter how you choose to do it, because if you do, you could actually tear one of the metal leaves right off of the plastic, I believe it's Mylar substrate, and then you would really be in a world of hurt. It truly was a lot of fun to do this, and I do not recommend that you try this at home. This is an annoyingly delicate ballet that is undoubtedly made for a person with much smaller fingers than the meat hooks I have. You've actually got to dovetail in a few things here to get everything to fit together. There's an ear over here that has to be dovetailed in. There's another one down here, and the most prominent of them all, which you have to get at the same time that you run this metal piece through this piece of plastic, is this ear over here. And it's compounded matter. It compounds matters by virtue of the fact that not only is there a metal ear that's part of this assembly, there's also a plastic ear that's part of the battery assembly. So this was not fun at all. You could exhaust your allowance of profanity on this, and in the end you might say, just screw it. Fortunately, by the time you get this done, that's exactly what you're ready to do. Go ahead and put the screws in, and they should tighten up readily. Now, these do not need to be killing tight. In fact, you will probably strip something out if you try to make them that way. Now, before I go ahead and put all of this back together, I am going to test it once more just to make sure that it still happens to work. And if it doesn't, I may throw it out the window. Alright, it definitely does still work. You can see what the camera is looking at. It's actually looking at that stereo receiver and the smoke alarm over there. And another thing that you have to make sure is lined up and doesn't fall away throughout this entire entertaining dance that we just got through doing is the input for the power connection. Now, the power connection, which seems to have been intermittent earlier, seems to be rock solid right now. At least my tapping on it just now didn't actually seem to phase it. So maybe this camcorder just needed a good exploratory surgery to convince it that I actually meant business. Alright, well, we're getting closer on the list of things that remain to be done. The entries are dwindling rather rapidly. Got to go ahead and put the tape basket cover on the side, put this rubber flap in place, and then find homes for all these screws. And hopefully I won't have too many of them left over when I get through with this. Oh, and there's this thing as well, this little plastic piece that goes near the nose of the camcorder up here. And there it is, looking like a camcorder once again. No leftover screws, nothing that wouldn't go back together, no binding parts, nothing that is working inappropriately, but we must do a power test. Have to verify that the camcorder works. Now, it came with an InfoLithium L battery, an NP-F550. It's been my experience that apparently a lot of people sprung for the upgraded InfoLithium batteries back in the day, as I don't believe that anything more than the base level 330 that you see right here was the standard inclusion with any of these Sony camcorders or the Mavica digital cameras that also happen to use these particular batteries. But if I am wrong about that, a gentle correction would certainly be appreciated. One thing that is indisputable fact, however, is the fact that these Sony batteries are of excellent quality. You know, almost everybody says, oh, after 5 years, a lithium-ion battery is going to be junk, and most of the time I would say those people are absolutely right. So I don't know what kind of, shall we say, awesome sauce, as Bizarre Furhead might put it, Sony used in their recipe or chemistry for these batteries, but obviously they were not cheapskating on them, because the NP-F330 that you're looking at right now is the oldest InfoLithium L series battery that I own. It's, about 17 years old at this point, and it still runs a camcorder for about 2 hours, no problem. As I found one day when I had it connected to the camcorder in the studio without plugging in the power cord. Now, granted, the actual runtime would be less if there had been a tape in that camcorder, but there wasn't, and that was how it worked out. I was really very impressed. The camcorder was right on the cusp of giving up its last gasp. It was blinking the low battery symbol. But I was very impressed at how long this battery managed to hold that camcorder. And I'm confident that this one will come up to perfect health as well. As when I plugged it into this camcorder earlier and let it charge up a bit, the InfoLithium system said that it had reached a point where there would be about 30 minutes of runtime. So I think this battery will come up as well. In fact, I've only ever had one that didn't. And when I cracked the case open, which I do not recommend because lithium batteries have absolutely no sense of humor about being potentially mistreated, I discovered that the cells inside it were completely rusty. So let's go ahead and stick this battery on here. And this camcorder always makes some sounds from the transport initializing. I've got it in the standby position, so when I turn the power on, the lens should come open. and we should hear a beep. Right now I have no memory battery in this camcorder, so it's probably going to be surly about that. It certainly doesn't remember any of its settings. I'll need to get like a CR2025, I think it is. This is probably the original. Only rarely have I come across a camcorder where someone actually kept up with replacing these. And given that that one says Sony on it, like I say, it's probably an original. So let's go ahead and switch this thing over to VCR mode. I should have probably hooked it up to a television, and we'll see if the tape basket functions. Well, that's certainly a lot more promising than what we had. So here's the tape that came with it. I'll go ahead and put that in there and close this gently and see if it eats the tape like a boss, which it probably will since this is when I'm recording it. And we'll run the tape forward just a little bit. And we'll see if it actually manages to play it. Yep, it's definitely playing that tape. No sound, but then again, this model doesn't have a flip-out viewfinder, something I did not notice until I actually started working on it. But it does seem to be functional, so the next thing that I'll do is I'll either dig up a blank Video 8 or High 8 tape, or maybe there'll be a blank space on this particular tape, and I'll do a little test of this camcorder. So thank you for watching, and feel free to leave a comment if you have one. Oh, and before I go, I should probably make sure that the night shot switch actually works, and that may be a problem. I think I've got the night shot switch misaligned. Oh well, that's not bad for out of the gate, and it probably won't be too terribly hard to fix that. Hopefully I can fudge things a little bit without having to take it all the stinking way apart again. Alright, thank you for watching, and feel free to leave a comment if you have one, and if you made it this far after listening to this incredibly protracted ramble.